"Don't look into the darkness of the courtyards, and I'll explain why." It was always in the summer when insomnia hit me hardest. The nights were hot, suffocating, and even when the fan was on full blast, the air felt dense, almost impossible to breathe. I used to toss and turn in bed, trying to find a position that would give me some relief, but the sheets clung to my skin and sleep never came. Instead, the discomfort just grew. During that period, I started creating a refuge on the balcony of my apartment. Nothing much, just a comfortable chair and a small table where I left the books I was reading. That corner had become my escape from the endless nights. When the heat and boredom became unbearable, I'd grab my favorite book and retreat there, surrounded by the silence of the night. The view wasn't great, the building's courtyard, with a few trees and the occasional stray cat. But it was enough. Somehow, the quiet of that place, combined with the distant sound of cars and the faint hum of the city, calmed me. The small town we lived in seemed to shut down after 10 p.m. Not much happened there, and I liked that. The world seemed distant, while I was safely tucked away in my reading nook. Those nights had their own sound, a silence almost palpable, broken only by the occasional car passing in the distance or the hum of a poorly tuned fan from a neighbor's apartment. I was used to those sounds. They had become part of my nightly routine, something comforting in their repetition. But that night, something felt different. As I flipped through the pages of my book, something caught my attention in the corner of my view. A movement. It wasn't an animal, not a stray cat. It was something bigger. I looked up and put the book aside for a moment, trying to focus on the courtyard below. There was someone down there, a figure. They were slowly crossing the courtyard, almost as if they didn't want to be noticed. I tensed up, trying to understand what I was seeing, but the darkness made it hard to distinguish any details. For a brief moment, the figure stopped in the middle of the courtyard, and that's when I felt a chill run down my spine. Something was wrong. And then, in the blink of an eye, the figure disappeared. I sat there, trying to convince myself that what I saw was nothing. Maybe a neighbor coming home late, cutting across the courtyard by a shortcut I didn't know about. But even as I tried to rationalize it, the way that figure disappeared disturbed me. There was no door there, no corner or bend where someone could just vanish. It was as if the figure had been swallowed by the darkness. I put the book aside and leaned forward, squinting in an attempt to see the courtyard below better. Everything was as it always was. The still trees, the concrete ground, the dim streetlights casting weak light over the place. There was no sign of anyone, just emptiness. But that unsettling feeling wouldn't go away. It was a tightness in my chest, an odd urgency to understand what I had just seen. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the dread was there, lingering. Maybe it was just the heat, insomnia playing tricks on me, but there was something about that figure that left me unsettled, as if something was deeply wrong. The kind of thing the brain tries to alert you to, but that words can't quite explain. I ran my hand over my face, trying to calm myself, but I kept staring at the courtyard, as if expecting that figure to return. Fear and curiosity mixed, waging a battle inside me. Every minute that passed, the silence of the night seemed denser, more oppressive. I could hear my own heart beating faster. Whoever that was hadn't just disappeared. There was something about the abruptness, almost supernatural, that made the fear settle in me in a way I couldn't ignore. The tension was building, tightening my stomach. I remained still, trying to figure out if what I had seen was real, or if it was just the darkness playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. Something was wrong. Even after the figure disappeared, the discomfort persisted, sharp, like an itch deep in my mind. I closed the book with a soft snap, leaving it on the table beside me. I couldn't concentrate on reading again. I got up from the chair, my gaze fixed on the courtyard below, trying to understand what exactly had happened. Something was bothering me, something that didn't make sense. The figure couldn't have just disappeared like that. My eyes scanned every inch of the ground poorly lit by the weak streetlights. That's when I noticed something I had missed before. There, in the middle of the courtyard, a manhole cover was open. The lid was slightly tilted, almost out of place. I frowned. What was that manhole doing open at this hour? No one messed with those things, especially not in the middle of the night. A thought crossed my mind. What if the figure had fallen in? The idea of an accident made me shudder. Maybe that hurried movement I had noticed wasn't someone trying to hide, but someone in danger. My body reacted before I had time to think it through. I grabbed an old flashlight that was always tossed in the corner of the balcony. It had seen better days, but it was better than nothing. My heart was pounding as I descended the stairs 2 at a time, the flashlight trembling slightly in my sweaty hand. Each step echoed off the building's walls, the sound amplified by the deep silence of the night. I reached the ground floor and carefully pushed open the door to the courtyard, as if expecting to find something just on the other side. The warm night breeze wrapped around me as soon as I stepped out. The courtyard was deserted, quiet as always. The shadows of the trees stretched across the ground, motionless. And there was the manhole, still with the cover misaligned. The flashlight illuminated the scene with a shaky glow, casting distorted shadows. I walked toward the manhole, each step heavy, a knot forming in my stomach. When I got close enough, I crouched down and, with a moment of hesitation, pointed the light inside. The beam penetrated the darkness below, revealing only concrete and a metal ladder leading down into what appeared to be a narrow tunnel. Nothing. No sign of the figure. But somehow this didn't reassure me. On the contrary, the sight of the empty space only increased the feeling that something was very wrong. I stood there for a moment in silence, listening to the muffled sound of my own breathing, while the wind made dry leaves scrape across the ground around me. I knew I should go back, close the manhole and leave it alone. But an unease gripped me. Something was pulling me, an irrational need to discover what was going on, even though I couldn't explain why. For a moment, the silence was absolute. I was leaning over the manhole, the weak beam of the flashlight illuminating the void below. The warm wind whispered through the trees, but all I could hear was the muffled sound of my accelerated breathing. I wanted to convince myself there was nothing strange down there, that the missing figure was just a trick of my tired mind. Then I heard it. A soft noise, a sound that made my muscles tense instantly, came from deep within the manhole. Something metallic, like a faint scraping, followed by a quieter, muffled sound, almost like breathing. My fingers tightened around the flashlight. The shaky beam of light traveled down the opening, dancing along the concrete walls. As much as I wanted to step back, my feet were glued to the ground. That sound continued, now closer, as if something was climbing, slowly approaching. I swallowed hard, trying to prepare myself for whatever it was. The flashlight wobbled in my sweaty hands as I struggled to keep it focused on the dark. And then suddenly I saw it. The light found something. Not just the empty manhole, but a shape, a humanoid figure, crawling through the shadows below. My heart raced. The creature was slowly climbing up the metal ladder, its hands gripping each rung with a calculated slowness, as if it wasn't in any hurry to reach the surface. But it was when the light hit its face that the true horror revealed itself. My entire body froze. The figure, now clearly visible, had a distorted face, covered in grotesque scars. The skin looked burned, twisted into deep marks, as if it had melted and been mended wrong. One of the eyes seemed misplaced, while the other stared at me, glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the darkness. There was no expression, no emotion, just a blank, unsettling stare. I took a step back, fear overwhelming me, but I couldn't look away. My body trembled, unable to process the sight before me. The creature's face lifted slightly, as if it had noticed me, but without any human reaction. It was like looking at something that shouldn't exist, something beyond comprehension. Suddenly, my instincts kicked in, and I backed away quickly, stumbling over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the ground, its beam spinning in all directions as I struggled to escape that hellish sight. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath came in short gasps, and for a second, I thought I would faint from sheer terror. Somehow, I managed to get to my feet, racing back to the building's door. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran back across the courtyard, each shadow around me seeming more threatening than the last. The terror was almost palpable, a suffocating presence chasing me, even though I knew the creature remained at the bottom of that damned manhole. I didn't look back. The mere thought of seeing it again was unbearable. All I wanted was distance, anything to get me away from it. As soon as I reached the building's door, I nearly ripped it off the hinges with the force I used to push it open. The stairs up to my apartment seemed endless, but I climbed 2 steps at a time, short of breath, my heart exploding in my chest. When I finally reached the hallway of my floor, my trembling hands could barely fit the key into the lock. Every sound around me was a threat. Every creak seemed to indicate something was approaching. I was falling apart under the weight of irrational fear. With a final push, I entered the apartment and slammed the door shut. I locked it, turned the additional lock, and even slid the security chain into place. Then I took a few steps back, staring at the door as if it were the only barrier between me and the horror I had just witnessed. My legs gave out, and I let myself fall to the floor, my back against the wall, my chest rising and falling in heavy, uncontrolled breaths. My head throbbed. I tried to rationalize, to put my thoughts in order, but what I had seen, it didn't make sense. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but the creature's face projected itself in my mind with absurd clarity. The blank stare, the scars that covered its skin like cracks in broken glass, the burns that seemed eternal, as if hell had marked that figure forever. It must be a homeless person, I thought, desperately seeking an explanation. Someone living in the tunnels beneath the city, someone who had an accident, maybe. A normal person, deformed by time or tragedy. The words ran through my mind, but they sounded hollow, like fragile excuses that couldn't hold up to the reality of what I had witnessed. I wanted to believe that was all it was. A lost man, with a life that had robbed him of his dignity and appearance. But something deep inside me screamed that it wasn't just that. The way it moved, slow, methodical, and that sudden disappearance in the courtyard. Those weren't human movements, those weren't actions that fit into what I knew of the real world. The apartment was completely silent, but I felt like the air around me was heavy, as if something had stayed trapped with me. The adrenaline was still rushing through my veins, keeping me alert, but exhaustion was starting to creep in. The soft light from the bedroom lamp didn't seem enough to keep away the shadows creeping at the edges of my vision. I got up with difficulty, still trembling, and walked to the window. Down below, the courtyard looked exactly as it always did. No sign of movement, nothing out of place. The manhole, now almost hidden by the darkness, looked like just an ordinary opening in the ground. If it weren't for what I had seen, I could swear it was just another normal night. But I knew, something down there, beneath the surface, was horrible, real, and it was much closer than I'd like. When the sun finally came up, the weak morning light filtering through the curtains, I didn't feel any safer. I had stayed awake all night, unable to close my eyes for even a second. My mind, still racing, replayed every detail of what I had seen, searching for some sense or logic. But what tormented me most was the growing doubt. Had it been real? As daylight arrived, clarity began to take shape, and part of me started to doubt. The darkness of the night can play tricks on the mind, especially when you're alone, tired, and vulnerable. Maybe my insomnia, combined with the suffocating heat, had caused my imagination to run wild. I tried to convince myself of this as I looked around the apartment, now bathed in the calm light of dawn. Still, the uncertainty lingered. I stood up with difficulty, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The fear felt less oppressive in the daylight, but the memory of that disfigured face still hovered like a shadow over me. I walked to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, looking at my reflection in the mirror. I looked as exhausted as I felt, my eyes red and swollen, as if I hadn't slept in a week. After getting dressed, an idea began to form in my mind. I needed to go back to the courtyard. I needed to see with my own eyes that everything was normal, that the manhole was closed, that the previous night had been nothing more than a nightmare fueled by exhaustion. I walked down the stairs slowly, the morning light filtering through the hallway windows, making everything seem safer and more familiar. The courtyard, when I opened the building's door, was as empty as always, silent, the same distant sounds of cars and birds filling the air. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I walked to the spot where the manhole was. My heart quickened slightly, but I forced my feet to keep moving forward. When I finally arrived, the manhole was closed. The cover was perfectly in place, as if no one had ever moved it. The ground around it was clean, with no sign that anything unusual had happened the night before. I stood there for a while, staring at the cover, trying to process what this meant. The feeling was strange, almost surreal. The normalcy of the place contrasted violently with the terror I had felt. The sun was shining gently over the courtyard, the trees still, the wind brushing the leaves. No trace of the previous night, no clue to tell me that what I had seen was real. Doubt began to take hold of me. Did I imagine it all? The question hammered in my mind. Everything seemed so clear at the time, but now, in the daylight, the details felt less sharp, more distant, like fragments of a dream that begin to fade as soon as you wake up. I shook my head, trying to push away the thought that I might be going crazy. But as much as I wanted to believe it had all been a nighttime hallucination, something inside me couldn't accept that explanation. The feeling I had when I saw that creature, the visceral fear that ran down my spine, was too real to dismiss as just a figment of my imagination. Still, the manhole was closed. The courtyard was exactly as it should be, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't find a single sign to prove otherwise. I spent the rest of the morning in silence, sitting at the kitchen table, my coffee cooling without me taking more than a few sips. The sunlight, now stronger, filled the apartment, but I couldn't shake that unsettling feeling, that mixture of uncertainty and fear that had been haunting me since the night before. The closed manhole, the empty courtyard, everything seemed perfectly normal. And yet, what I had seen was etched in my mind with terrifying clarity. When Jake called me in the early afternoon, suggesting we meet up, I knew I had to tell him. Maybe by speaking out loud it would make more sense. Or maybe he could help me understand if I was really starting to lose it. Jake had always been the voice of reason in our family. The older brother, more grounded, he had a practical way of seeing the world that, at times, annoyed me. But at that moment, I needed that pragmatism. We met at a cafe near my apartment, a place we'd been going to since we were kids, where conversations flowed more easily. I sat at the table, waiting for him to arrive. When Jake finally showed up, with his relaxed demeanor and a faint look of curiosity on his face, I didn't waste any time. "I need to tell you something," I said, even before he ordered his coffee. Jake raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. He settled into the chair across from me, taking off his sunglasses and putting them in his shirt pocket. "Go ahead, Ethan. What is it this time?" He smiled, as if expecting another one of my exaggerated stories. I took a deep breath and began to tell him. I talked about the insomnia, about the nights on the balcony, about the strange movement in the courtyard. As I narrated the details of the figure that had disappeared, I saw Jake's expression change, from curiosity to something more skeptical. By the time I got to the part about the open manhole and the encounter with the disfigured creature, he was already shaking his head, arms crossed. And then, when I went back this morning, the manhole was closed, like nothing had ever happened. I concluded, my voice coming out quieter than I expected. Jake stayed silent for a moment, staring at the coffee in front of us, as if pondering what to say. But I already knew what was coming. "Ethan," he began, with that condescending tone he always used when he thought I was exaggerating. "Seriously? You really think you saw what? A monster coming out of a manhole? He chuckled softly but quickly tried to compose himself when he saw I wasn't amused. Man, you're dealing with insomnia. Not sleeping well. It's summer. It's hot. Your mind's racing. This was just your imagination playing tricks on you. I had expected him not to believe me, but hearing the words hit me in a way I didn't expect. Jake, I know what I saw, I retorted with more firmness than I thought I had. It wasn't just a dream. It wasn't something in my head. That man was down there. I saw his face, man. I swallowed hard, remembering the terror that had crawled up my spine. I felt that something was very wrong. Jake sighed, rubbing his face with his hands before responding. Ethan, you've always had this vivid imagination, man. Ever since we were kids. Remember that time you swore you saw a werewolf in the woods behind our house? Or when you thought there was a shadow following you at school? That's who you are. You've always been like that. But now, with the exhaustion and this insomnia, your brain's just exaggerating things. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that this time was different, but the words wouldn't come. Part of me, small but growing, began to wonder if he was right. My mind was so fatigued, and the heat had a way of distorting things. Maybe I was exaggerating. Maybe, once again, I was letting my imagination run wild. Jake continued, trying to reassure me. Look, I bet if you get some rest, sleep well tonight, all this will seem less. He paused, searching for the right words. Intense. Your brain's playing dirty with you, that's all. It's not uncommon. Homeless person or not, I bet tomorrow you'll look back and see that this was all just a big misunderstanding. As Jake spoke, the doubts began to grow within me. That disfigured face, the grotesque scars, the blank stare, everything seemed so real, so impossible to imagine. But if I was exaggerating, if my mind was really playing tricks on me, how could I trust what I had seen? Maybe you're right, I murmured, my voice barely audible. Jake smiled, satisfied that he had convinced me. Of course I am. Now, let's grab something to eat and forget about this story. Jake was right. At least for a while, I convinced myself of that. During the rest of the day, I tried to carry on with my life normally, ignoring the discomfort that still insisted on lodging itself in the back of my mind. I ran errands, watched TV, and, for a brief moment, allowed myself to believe that what I had seen was just the result of a sleepless night mixed with the suffocating heat of summer. Nothing more than a delusion. But that night, when I laid my head on the pillow, I felt that something was different. The apartment was immersed in an oppressive silence, the air still and thick. I closed my eyes, trying to convince myself that I was safe, that what I had seen had been nothing more than an invention of my exhausted brain. Still, sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it brought something far worse than the fatigue of insomnia. Nightmares. In the dream, I was back in the courtyard, the air so hot and dense it felt like it was suffocating me. Everything was dark, darker than usual, as if the night had swallowed up any trace of light. And there, in the center of the courtyard, the manhole was open just like on the night I had first seen it. My feet moved on their own, leading me toward that opening. I knew what I was going to find, but I couldn't stop. The darkness inside the manhole was total, like a bottomless pit. But even without the flashlight, I knew he was there. The disfigured figure, the scars twisting his skin, the blank, unsettling stare. He wasn't hiding in the shadows anymore. This time, he was waiting for me. Suddenly, the creature began to rise from the hole, climbing the steps with slow, fluid movements, as if gravity didn't exist for him. His deformed face appeared first, emerging from the darkness like a mask of horror, his eyes fixed on me. His thin, twisted hands gripped the rungs of the ladder, but it was as if he wasn't climbing. It was as if he were pulling me down. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The terror paralyzed me, as the figure got closer and closer, until I could smell the burning and rot that exuded from his skin. When he finally reached out a hand toward me, something inside me snapped. A scream tore from my throat, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the very air around us was sucking away any hope of escape. I woke up gasping, my body drenched in sweat, as if I had been dragged back into my room. It took me a few seconds to realize where I was, feeling my heart hammering in my chest. The clock beside the bed read 3:17 a.m., and the sensation of suffocation was still there. The nightmare had been so real, so intense, that for a moment I was sure that if I looked out the window, I'd see the manhole open down below, with that creature waiting for me. But I didn't look. I knew that would only feed my fear. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself that it was just a dream. But the feeling that something terrible was lurking remained stuck to me like a second skin. The next morning, I tried to move on. I pushed the memory of the nightmare aside, trying to bury it deep within my mind, along with the doubts about the previous night. But as the days passed, the situation only worsened. The nightmare returned, night after night, each time more vivid, each time more suffocating. Sometimes the dream started differently. I could be anywhere else, on the balcony of the apartment or even walking down some random street. But somehow the courtyard and the manhole always appeared, and always, without fail, the disfigured figure was there, crawling out of the darkness, chasing me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my body exhausted, but my mind incapable of finding rest. Dark circles began to form under my eyes, and the weight of exhaustion followed me like a constant shadow. More and more, I began to question whether Jake was wrong. Maybe I wasn't imagining things. Maybe, somehow, that creature didn't belong only to the world of dreams. During the day, the memories of the disfigured figure hovered at the edge of my consciousness. I avoided looking at the courtyard, avoided thinking about the manhole, but the fear persisted, always present, like an invisible threat. The more the nightmares tormented me, the more doubt gnawed at my mind. And deep down, I knew there was no escaping. Whether in the real world or in my dreams, that being was waiting for me. And no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, he would continue to haunt me. The nights became a vicious cycle of fear and exhaustion. Every time I closed my eyes, I knew he would be there, crawling from some dark corner, with that burned face and blank stare. During the day, I wandered around the city like a ghost, every shadow, every alley reminding me that something was lurking, something I still didn't understand. I knew that what I had seen in the manhole wasn't just a simple hallucination or nightmare. It was real, and somehow it was deeply connected to that place. But what led me to the confrontation wasn't a conscious choice. It was a calling, a silent warning, as if the courtyard itself, the manhole itself, was pulling me back to it. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the heat of summer gave way to the warm night breeze, something changed. It wasn't just the fatigue consuming me or the worried looks from neighbors, who seemed to sense that something in me was off. It was the feeling that I needed to finish it. I needed to go back to the courtyard. I needed to face whatever was there. Without thinking too much, I walked down the stairs and went straight to the courtyard. The streetlights were already starting to flicker, as they always did, casting long, unsettling shadows. The manhole was closed, but I knew that whatever was down there was waiting for me. This time, there was no turning back. I gripped the flashlight in my hand, even though I knew its weak light wouldn't be enough to protect me. With a heavy sigh, I walked over to the manhole and, with unusual effort, slid the metal cover aside. The hole gaping open to the darkness below was like an open wound in the city, a portal to something ancient, something that shouldn't be disturbed. The fear I had felt that night, weeks ago, returned in full force. But now, there was something else. A growing determination, a feeling that the answer was waiting for me, if I had the courage to descend. And I did. The metal ladder was cold to the touch, and with each rung, the darkness around me seemed to close in more, as if the tunnel were swallowing me whole. The smell of dampness and mold filled the air, mixed with something more rotten, something that seemed to come from a time far beyond the present. My feet finally touched the concrete floor, and the flashlight trembled in my hand as it lit up the tunnel ahead of me. It was narrow and long, with wet, cracked walls, as if it had been slowly crumbling over the years. As I moved forward, the sound of my steps echoed, but there was something else in the air. Presence. Something was watching me, and then I saw him again. The same disfigured figure, emerging from the shadows further ahead. His burned eyes fixed on me. But this time he wasn't hiding. He was waiting. A cold fear shot down my spine, but I forced myself to keep going. The flashlight shook as I pointed its beam at him, and that's when I realized he wasn't just a deformed man. He was something more, something that carried a burden of hatred and pain that went beyond the destroyed flesh. "What are you?" I murmured, my voice sounding weak in the tunnel. The creature didn't respond, but as I got closer, something revealed itself on the walls around me, something I hadn't noticed before. Engravings, ancient symbols, carved into the concrete, covered in moss and dirt, like marks from a forgotten past. My heart raced. The city, it was hiding secrets far deeper than I had imagined. I felt the pieces starting to fall into place. That place, the courtyard, the manhole, the tunnels, was part of something old. Something that had been sealed away a long time ago and that now, somehow, was trying to emerge. The creature in front of me was just a fragment of this evil, a twisted guardian, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. His voice finally echoed, hoarse and suffocated, as if speaking were an enormous effort. "They left us here to die." That's when I understood. He wasn't the evil itself, but the result of a greater evil, something that had happened a long time ago, when the foundations of that city had been built on blood and sacrifice. The city's dark secrets had been buried with him and others like him, victims of something terrible, something forgotten by time, but that still pulsed beneath the surface. The horror consumed me, but so did the urgency to act. I needed to stop this. I didn't know exactly how, but I felt that, somehow, I was part of the key to ending this cycle of terror. The creature moved, taking a step toward me, and instinctively, I backed away. But this time, I wasn't there to flee. I pointed the flashlight directly at his face, illuminating every scar, every burn. He blinked, as if the light hurt him, but he didn't stop advancing. "Why do you chase me?" I asked, my voice broken by fear. He stopped for a moment, his disfigured gaze fixed on mine. "Because you are the last one who remembers." The last one who remembers. Those words echoed in my mind, bringing to the surface a dark truth. I was part of this. Somehow, my connection to that city, to its buried secrets, was deeper than I could have ever imagined. That was it. The true evil wasn't just the creature before me. It was what the city had done, what it had buried. And now everything was surfacing. With a desperate scream, I grabbed the manhole cover and pushed it with all my strength, sealing the hole. The tunnel echoed with the sound of metal slamming onto the ground, and for a moment, silence took over. For days after descending into the tunnel, I avoided the courtyard. I could barely leave the house. The heat of summer remained suffocating, but the weight I carried was much deeper. The nights gave me no rest. The nightmares, which had once been just terrifying visions, now felt like echoes of a truth I didn't want to accept. Something had changed in me, something I couldn't name. The city continued at its usual slow pace. The streets were still quiet. The same people with the same faces walked down the sidewalks, unaware of anything. But for me, everything had changed. What I had seen down there, what the tunnel had revealed to me, was an ancient truth and impossible to ignore. I knew I couldn't tell anyone. Jake already thought I was going crazy, and he'd be the first to send me to a hospital if he knew I had gone back to the manhole. So, I kept everything to myself, trying to live as if nothing had happened. But the city, it seemed to breathe along with me, as if it knew I was carrying a piece of the dark secrets it had hidden for so long. That night, a few weeks after closing the manhole, sleep came easily. For the first time, there was no disfigured face chasing me in my dreams, just the void. I dreamt of the courtyard, but it was quiet, empty of any presence. It was as if the city was at peace. But when I woke up, something felt out of place. There was a familiar smell in the air, a faint but unmistakable odor, burnt. My body instantly broke out in goosebumps. I got up slowly and went to the window, hesitant. The courtyard was there, unchanged as always. but something caught my attention. There in the center, right where the manhole was, the cover was open. Not just open. It had been removed and placed to the side, carefully, almost meticulously. Fear washed over me again, but this time it wasn't paralyzing. It was as if I knew what was coming. I looked at the gaping hole and, for a brief moment, I thought I saw something. A subtle movement, like a shadow hiding at the edge of my vision. I should go down, check it out up close. Part of me screamed to run, to call Jake, to get away from that place once and for all. But another part, deeper, knew that it wouldn't end like this. The city wouldn't let me go so easily. I took a deep breath and turned away, leaving the window behind. I closed the curtains, blocking the view of the courtyard. I wouldn't go down. Not anymore. I knew what the manhole hid, and I knew that the darkness beneath the city wasn't something that could be defeated, only contained for a time. Maybe it's waiting for me again. Maybe not. But the truth is, in that city, where secrets are buried deep like roots, no one ever truly escapes. The evil that lives in the depths doesn't disappear. It just adapts, silently, waiting for the next chance to rise to the surface. That night, as the distant sound of thunder echoed through the city, something whispered in my mind. A whisper from the depths, from the place where secrets live. And deep down, I knew, no matter how hard I tried to run, a part of me would always be trapped down there. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel and make sure to catch the next story, now playing on the screen.